Thank you very much. It's very nice to be back here. And like you said, I've been impressed with how many bird species I've already seen on campus in just the day I've been here. So quite a change from last time. What I want to do today is sort of give you a crash course in ornithology. I'm going to cover a lot of ground, and hopefully you'll learn a lot about birds, and then hopefully we'll have some time at the end. I'm going to show you some pretty pictures of birds of the Middle East. Ornithology, of course, is the study of birds. The birds are in the class Aves. There are now thought to be about 40 extant orders of birds. The largest order of the Paciformes are the songbirds, and we'll talk a little bit about them in a little bit. Birds are also classified based on whether they can sing or not. So the sub-Aucenes are birds that do not technically sing, and then the Aucenes are the birds that do sing. Currently, we think that there are about 10,500 species of birds in 250 families. It's thought that most species have been discovered, although occasionally there are new species that are being discovered, particularly in Southeast Asia and South America. But more species are now being added through the molecular analysis. So now that we have these molecular techniques, birds that were thought to be a single species before are actually being discovered to be two or more species. These are some of the characteristics of birds. Most birds are bipedal with a backbone, which is not unique to vertebrates. Feathers are thought to be a unique feature, but as some of you know, there are now some very detailed fossils being discovered, particularly in China, that suggest that maybe dinosaurs had feathers, and that maybe this is not a unique characteristic to birds. And of course, some people think birds are dinosaurs, so, but that's not really my field. The bills are a unique feature, the bony structure, as we see, covered by a keratin sheath. And the modern birds do not have teeth, although, as we'll see, some of the fossil birds did have teeth. The unique feature of this is that they have this flexible upper jaw. They have this articulation of the wing, and then all birds lay egg, which is a unique feature of the vertebrates. If you look at the other vertebrates, the mammals, the reptiles, amphibians, and fishes, there's a variety of different ways that these vertebrates reproduce, but all birds lay eggs, and so that's sort of a unique characteristic. Here's the range in size of living birds. This is the bee hummingbird, which is endemic to Cuba, and it only weighs 1.6 grams. And then this is the ostrich, which is the largest living bird, and you can see that they get to be quite big and quite tall. Rather exciting discovery this summer. This was just published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science in July, is this particular fossil that was discovered in South Carolina in the United States. And this is thought to be the longest wingspan of any bird, and you can see here that this particular bird had a wingspan of about 7 meters. And it was a pelagic bird, and this is what this means. Pelagornis means a bird that's pelagic, and pelagic means it's a bird of the open ocean. So this bird was thought to be a glider. And another characteristic of this particular group here is that they actually do have teeth. So you can see here that it has a pretty good set of teeth here, and these birds were thought to be fish eaters. More recently, we see the moas of New Zealand, and these were formidable birds as well. You can see here is a sort of the average size human, and these are various species of moas, and you can see this number 4 moa actually was about 12 feet tall, 4 meters, and these things weighed over 230 kilos. They were found only in New Zealand, and they went extinct about 600 years ago when the Maui showed up in New Zealand, and apparently recent evidence suggests they went extinct very quickly. Maybe within 100 years, they all went extinct. So here are some feathers. This is the basic bird feather. And this is generally referred to as a contour feather. And if it's in the wing, it's referred to as a remides. And if it's a tail feather, it's referred to as rectrices. The other kind of feathers are these down feathers, and then the sort of these semi-down feathers. And another type of feather is a plume that are found in birds like egrets. So feathers are constructed of keratin, which is the same substance that hair is made out of, or fingernails or horns. These feathers grow in tracts, as we'll see. And most birds replace their feathers once a year or twice a year, or even rarely 3 times a year. So the feathers wear out. Okay? They suffer from wear, and so they have to be replaced during this molting period. And the feathers, of course, are vital to the bird biology. That's why they can fly, and it's also why birds are endothermic and homeothermic, meaning that they generate their own body heat and that their body temperature stays relatively constant, like mammals. So mammals and birds are the only ones that are endothermic and homeothermic. So if you actually look at a bird, they actually have a lot of bare skin showing, and these feathers grow in these tracts on the back. So this is like the dorsal tract here, and then there's a lot of feather tracts associated with the head, and then these tracts that are associated with the various kind of feathers. And we'll talk a little bit more about these, but the primaries are the ones that are the main flight feathers, and then there are secondaries and tertiaries. The secondaries here are these feathers here. And when the feathers grow, then the bird appears to be fully covered. But in fact, if you actually look at the skin layer, they actually have a lot of bare skin under those feathers. So here's a contour feather, and this is basically what most contour feathers look like. It has a shaft, the main shaft here, and then this is called the outer vein, and this is the leading edge of the wing, and this is the inner vein, and we can see that there's a great asymmetry here between this leading edge of the wing and the inner vein of the wing, and so this is the way that the bird feather is oriented, and this asymmetry is what makes lift when the birds are flying. This is another look at a feather. This is the main shaft, which is also referred to as the rachis. This part of the feather is referred to as the vane. There are these striations that you see in the feather, and those are referred to as the barbs. A lot of feathers have a little downy barb associated with the bottom here, and then this is the quill or the calamus. This is the part that's going to be coming out of the feather tract. And this is the microstructure of feathers. And you have these, the shaft here, and then coming off of the shaft are these barbs or these striations. And then there are these interconnections between the barbs, and these are the barbules go in this direction, and then these things that are called hooks go in this direction. And it is the interaction between the barbules and the hooks that gives the feather its structure. And so when you see a bird that's preening, what the bird is doing is the bird is actually rearranging these hooks and barbules so that they're back together. So here's a situation where the hooks and the barbules have come apart, and when the bird is preening, the bird puts these back together so that the feather is intact. And that's what it looks like under a microscope. You can see the various structures here associated with the barbs and the hooks that give the structure to the feather. So here's what a bird looks like when it has fully feathered, and these feathers typically are named after the feather tract that they came from. So here we have the primaries here, which are the main flight feathers. That's why they're called primaries, and they're coming out of the primary feather tract. And then here we have the secondaries, which are the flight feathers that are coming out of the secondary flight tract. And then these over here are called the tertiaries, and they are coming out of the tertiary feather tract. When we talk about birds and we talk about bird identification, they're typically, we talk about things like, the color of the primaries, the color of the secondary coverts, which are on top of the flight feathers, and we talk about, does it have an eye-ring or does it not have an eye-ring, and so forth. So that sort of gives you the orientation of what the plumage looks like on the bird. So we know that birds are quite colorful, particularly the males, and the way that these colors are seen has various origins. And so blue and white are actually structural colors. There is no blue pigment, there is no white pigment. It's just because of the structure of the feathers. The birds that do have pigment typically are the ones that have yellow, red, black, brown, or some of the greens associated with their feathers. And the colors green, violet, purple, and iridescent are a combination of structural color and pigment color. So here's a bird that occurs here in Saudi Arabia, the European roller, and it appears to be a brightly colored blue bird, but it does not have any pigment associated with it. What you're seeing here is the scatter of light, which is called Rayleigh scattering, which is the same phenomenon that turns the sky blue. And so this is just a structural scattering of light by small particles, which turns the bird blue in color. So that's in contrast to birds that are red in color. And so here we have the greater flamingo. And the greater flamingo gets its red color from eating crustaceans. So it takes the red color out of the crustaceans that it's eating and deposits that in its feathers. So if you go to the zoo and the flamingos are white in color, that means they're not being fed properly. Okay? That the zookeeper is not feeding them the right food. Because if they're feeding them the right food, they should maintain their red color in captivity. Now finches, and this is the Sinai rosefinch. The finches get their color from seeds. So they eat seeds, and the seeds have carotenoids in the seed coating, and these birds actually deposit that directly into their feathers. And so this is from eating crustaceans, the red color here, and this red color here is from eating seeds. So iridescence is caused by the light hitting these barbules, the structures that we talked about in the feather. And so some of you, I know, have seen this, where you're looking at a bird and it looks really dull in color, and all of a sudden it turns towards you, and all of a sudden it's brightly colored. And that is because of how the light is being changed by interaction with these barbules. So this bird actually does not have any pigment associated with these colors. These colors, and this bird here, these colors are coming directly from the way that the light is interacting with the feathers. And so these are sunbirds. These are birds that are found here in the old world, which are analogous to the hummingbirds that we have in the new world. And then some birds scatter all light, and those birds appear to be white. So these birds have no white pigment at all. The structure of their feathers is scattering all light, and so they appear to be white. And this is the crab plover, which is a common bird here on campus. And this is an endemic to the Red Sea area. And then this is the black-winged stilt. These are both shorebirds, and this bird here does not have any white pigmentation at all. It's just the feathers are scattering all the light, and so it appears to be white. So molting has several functions. The one function that we talked about is the function of replacing feathers. The feathers wear out and they need to be replaced. Another function is that a lot of male birds are brightly colored during the breeding season, but they are dull colored in the non-breeding season. So here we have another sunbird, the purple sunbird. And so the male molts before the breeding season, and this is what the male looks like during the breeding season. And this is what the female looks like. So you can see the male's quite brightly colored and the female is rather dull in coloration. But then after the breeding season, the male molts again, and this is what the male looks like in winter, or what's called the eclipse plumage. And you can see this male has just a few little blue feathers still there. But so that's another reason for molting, is to get into the breeding, what's called the breeding plumage, and then to also get into this eclipse plumage. So most birds molt their feathers one at a time. And so here we have a vulture here, and I think you can see that this vulture is molting these feathers right here. So the molt goes from backwards. These are secondaries. The molt goes from backwards to forwards in the secondaries, and the molt goes from forward to backwards in the primaries. And so this feather is almost fully replaced. This feather is about 75% replaced, and this feather is about 50% replaced. And then you can see what's happened to these. You can see how damaged these feathers are, these primaries. And so those primaries need to be molted to repair this damage. But ducks are a little different. Ducks actually molt all their feathers, all their flight feathers at once. So after the breeding season is over, the ducks lose all of their primaries, and so for about 6 weeks they're incapable of flying. So there's this period where the ducks are just sort of swimming around out in the lake, and they're not capable of flying. So that's sort of unusual to shed all the primaries at once. So I said that one of the unique characteristics of birds is that they have this flexible upper jaw. And so here's a macaw, and we can see this has this flexible upper jaw, which is a unique characteristic of birds. And here we have some of the various types of bils. This is what a flamingo looks like. And there was a paper published several years ago pointing out that the flamingo bill is exactly like the baleen on a whale, that the flamingo actually strains the water to get its food, and there are lots of baleen-like structures associated with the flamingo bill. The swift is an insectivore, and so it has a relatively large mouth for its size, and it flies with its mouth open. Eagle, of course, is a predatory bird and has a hooked bill for catching prey, for ripping prey apart. The shoveler is a duck that has a very long bill, and it also strains the bottom. The shoveler is what's called a dabbling duck. It actually, when it feeds, it puts its bottom up in the air, and it strains the muck from the bottom of the body of water. Crossbills, as the name implies, have crossed bills, and some birds have right-hand crosses, and some birds have left-hand crosses. This is a left-hand crossbill, and people have been fascinated by this for probably 100 years, and a whole number of studies have been done, and it turns out it doesn't matter if you're left or right. But this bill is for popping open pine cones and eating pine seeds, and so that's what the function of the crossbill is. Egrets are fishers. The woodpeckers are ones that find their food in bark and trees. The avocet is a shorebird with this long bill, and it walks through the water, sweeping its bill back and forth like this to get food. The hawfinch is a seed eater, so it's got this massive bill for eating seeds. The wren is a insectivore, and so it has this very long, narrow bill for catching insects. The mallard is a duck, another dabbling duck. Curlews have this really long and exaggerated bill, and this is for catching prey like fiddler crabs, where they can actually grab out and grab a food item quite a ways from their body. The macaw we talked about is a fruit and seed eater. And then the skimmer, which we'll talk about a little bit later, the African skimmer actually flies with its lower mandible in the water, and it catches fish by using this lower mandible and upper mandible. And it turns out that the friction between the bill and the water actually keeps the bill at this size. If you take a skimmer and put it in captivity, its lower mandible just keeps sort of growing like Pinocchio. So that's a really stylized way of feeding. And here are some bills of various Arabian birds. This is the spoonbill, which is a bird that strains mud to get its food. Griffin vulture. Vultures, of course, are scavengers. Vultures do not have feathers on their heads because they typically are sticking their head into carcasses to eat, and so typically their heads are bald. This is a heron that has a bill for catching aquatic organisms. A striated heron is a fisher, and you can see it's got a long bill. Sooty falcon is a raptor. It's got this hooked bill for ripping prey. Kingfisher is a bird that, as the name implies, eats fish, The kingfisher actually has striations on the inside of the bill, so that if it grabs a fish, all the striations point down its throat, and the fish cannot go this way. The only way the fish can go is this way. And then here's the skimmer again, showing you what their bill actually looks like. So here you go. Boston Patriot, New England Patriots. This is a New England thing, Boston thing. And so people have long wondered about woodpeckers. You know, woodpeckers spend all their time pecking and extracting things from tree trunks, and so people got interested in how can woodpeckers peck against the tree. And it turns out that they discovered that the tongue of the woodpecker is actually attached to the front of the top of the head, and the tongue goes around the top of the skull and comes out here. And it's very tightly wrapped to the skull. And when the woodpecker wants to stick out its tongue, it can do that. And so this led to the redesigning of football helmets in the United States. Football helmets used to be loose around the head, but based on this research on woodpeckers and how woodpeckers peck, they decided that, in fact, football helmets should be really close to the head. So this research on woodpecker tongues led to the redesign. And for those of you who don't follow U.S. football, this is Tom Brady, the quarterback for the New England Patriots. I'm also a big Patriots fan. Okay, so here's some ways that birds catch their prey. The first is the osprey. The osprey is also sometimes called a fish hawk. The osprey actually comes down and grabs fish from the water. It turns out that the osprey can only do this so many times a day, this impact of hitting the water. And in the breeding season, if it catches enough fish for its young, then it stops for the day. And they always carry the fish head first. So you can impress your friends next time you see an osprey with a fish. And you say, well, look, it's flying with a fish. If it catches it with the head pointing backward, it immediately flips it around. And so this is the aerodynamics of carrying a fish. It has to be pointing head first. This is a peregrine falcon. This is referred to as a stoop. And this bird is looking at a prey item down below, and it's falling out of the sky to get that prey item. And peregrine falcons eat other birds. So the other name for peregrine falcon is duck hawk. And so what they do is they drop out of the sky and they literally hit other birds with their claws and knock them out, and then grab them. And this particular bird is estimated to be going 300 kilometers an hour. So they're really going pretty fast. And then here's another one. This is the Cape gannet. And the gannet is a fisher. They drop from about 30 meters, and they go straight into the water to catch fish. And these birds go about 100 kilometers an hour. So a little slower. These are some of the other adaptations. This is the foot of a raptor, and we see here that the raptor has, like most birds, has 4 claws. And it turns out that the ligaments of the raptors are such that, and you have to be really careful when you're bird banding these birds, these raptors. If the raptor grabs onto you with its 4 claws, and you try and pull one claw off, all 3 of the other claws get tighter. So they have the structure that, if they get their 4 talons into you, there's no way you can pull one of them off because the other ones will get tighter. A lot of insectivorous birds have these bristles associated with their bill, and these are called rictal bristles. And it's thought that these rictal bristles help catch the insects, that the insects get caught by these rictal bristles and go into the mouth of the insectivore. This is an owl here, and I think that you can see, even though it's tilted, I think you can see that the eyes of the owl are actually offset, and the facial discs and the associated ears in owls are offset. So here are the facial discs. Here's where the ears actually are. And so it turns out that you can put an owl in a totally dark room and let a mouse go, and the owl will find that mouse because it doesn't need to see it. It can tell by the sounds and this asymmetrical sound exactly where the prey item is. So this is an adaptation for foraging at night. The other interesting thing about owls is that they have a serrated edge on the leading edge of their feathers, and so when they fly, they're absolutely silent. So when they fly at night, not only can they tell where the prey are by the sounds, when they actually go for the prey, they don't make any sound with their feathers. So one of the things about birds, of course, is they fly, and birds have a lot of adaptations for flight. So they're streamlined. They have feathers, which are light. And as we'll see, their skeleton is quite different than other vertebrates. They have lots of fused bones, and they have what are called pneumatic bones, as we'll see in a minute. The muscles in the viscera are all centralized, so all the muscles in the viscera are in the body cavity, and so everything's near the center of gravity. They have wings, of course, and then in the non-breeding season, the gonads, the male and female gonads, atrophy, which aids in migration. So, for an example, here is what the pelvic region of a bird looks like. These are the 6 caudal vertebrae here, which are greatly reduced. These are the hip bones here, which are all fused together. And then you can see here that there are all these vertebrae that have been fused with the hip bone. So this is a great reduction in space and a great reduction in weight. The big bones in birds are typically hollow, and they have these structures which are called tuberculi, and these actually have been studied by structural engineers, and this has led to a lot of new ways of actually construction of buildings based on how these tabulae are found in these larger bird bones. And then there are things like these uncinate processes. The birds actually have a process that actually connects ribs together. So the ribs are not floating out here by themselves. The ribs are actually have a structure that strengthens them and makes them much stronger. So don't park your car under a bird roost. This is what we said before. All birds lay eggs, which is unusual among the vertebrate groups. And then all birds excrete uric acid, which is what this is. This is somebody who parked their car under a bird roost at night. And the reason for this is that they don't have a urinary bladder. So that's another structure that's missing in birds. And all birds excrete uric acid. Birds have a 4-chambered heart, which they share with mammals. Mammals have a 4-chambered heart. Some reptiles have a 4-chambered heart as well. The difference between birds and mammals is the aorta goes off to the right in birds, whereas the aorta goes off to the left in mammals. But if you look at the size of the heart versus the size of the animal, the birds actually have a heart is actually a little larger than what you would find in a mammal the same size. They have a unique lung system, which we'll talk about in a second. They have really rapid cellular respiration, so that leads to a high body temperature. The average body temperature for birds is about 40 degrees Celsius. And they're homeothermic. They are able to maintain a relatively constant body temperature. So here's what the bird lung system looks like. It takes 2 breaths to get a bolus of air in and out of the bird lung. So on the first breath, the air goes back into this air sac, and then on the exhale, the air goes up here. On the next inhale, the air goes to the cranial sac, and on the second exhale, the air leaves the lungs. So it takes 2 breaths to get the air to circulate through a bird lung. And there's this whole series of sacs, air sacs, that are associated with this. And then the air is going in this direction, and the blood is going in this direction, which is called a countercurrent flow. And so that maximizes the amount of oxygen. So the blood over here has very little oxygen, and the air coming this way has very little oxygen. But as the blood goes this way, it is encountering air that has more and more oxygen. So when it gets here, it's encountering the air that has the maximum amount of oxygen. And so the fact that the air is going this way and the blood is going that way is referred to as this countercurrent, and it maximizes the amount of oxygen that the bird can get into its blood. So one phenomenon here is the barred-headed goose. This is a goose that's found in Southeast Asia, and the bar-headed goose flies over the Himalayan mountains. So it breeds here, and then it flies over the Himalayan mountains to go spend the winter in India, and then in the spring it flies back over the top of the Himalayan mountains. And as most of you know, humans trying to climb Mount Everest, when they get to the top, they're barely moving. You know, the amount of oxygen is so low. And so the question is, how do these barred-headed goose fly over the Himalayas? Well, it turns out that they actually have a genetic mutation so that their blood has a higher affinity for oxygen. So there actually has been demonstrated that they do have a genetic reason why their blood has a higher affinity for oxygen. And so this increases the oxygen to the muscles. They've got relatively big wings for their size. But the other part of the story is they wait until it's favorable. And they just barely make it over the top. And so if they take off and the weather conditions change, they turn around and go back and wait. So it isn't as if they're flying, you know, way over the Himalayas. In fact, they're just sort of barely making it over. But nonetheless, they do have these adaptations for making this migration over the Himalayan mountains. What? It's based on cold fronts and highs, and they can sense when the weather is changing and that, you know, it's unfavorable. The winds are not going to be favorable. You know, if they take off and it sounds like the winds are favorable to fly north, and all of a sudden the wind switches, then they come back. So they're able to judge whether the conditions are favorable or not. Pretty cool. Oops. Okay, so it turns out that birds have fantastic vision. They do have color perception. They're really good at speed. resolution. They also see into the UV and into the infrared, which we can't do. The hearing is about equal to humans, but in some species, they can hear down to 10 hertz. And to put that in perspective, there are some birds, migratory birds, that can hear down to 10 hertz. And 10 hertz would be listening to the Rocky Mountains in western United States. Okay? That's what 10 hertz is. It's the rumble of air going through mountains. And apparently birds can sense that. And so if you're flying in the United States and you're a migratory bird, you just keep the Rocky Mountains to your left in the spring. You keep the Rocky Mountains to your right in the fall. But of course, that's an over-exaggeration. But nonetheless, they can hear a lot lower sounds than we can. And then it's becoming clear that some birds have really impressive intelligent capabilities, memory solving, tool use, and then people used to. There was a cliche that people had. If you're doing stupid things, people would say you have bird brain. You're bird brain. But now we've discovered that that's not true. But bird brains are equally as complex as mammal brains. So this has been a revolution in the last 10 to 15 years that actually bird brains are actually quite complex. All right. So what is this bird doing? All right. This is a little kestrel, and this little kestrel has flipped its head upside down. And so the way you get, if you ever have the opportunity, the way you get the bird to do this is you start walking from a distance from the bird, and you walk slowly towards the bird, a raptor. When you get to a certain distance, the raptor is going to flip its head upside down. And the reason for that is that the raptors have 3 fovea. Okay? We only have 1, right? But raptors have 3, and when you get to a certain distance, the raptor is actually trying to see you with the fovea that's on top of its head. And so it's flipped its head upside down to use that fovea. And so this is what raptors actually see. Here's a raptor head, and we see here that they have binocular vision in front of them, of course, but then they also have quite detailed vision in front of them. They also can tell what's going on here, and they actually can see behind them. So raptors can actually see about 270 degrees. Okay? There is a blind spot behind their head, but their eyes are set on the side of their head, and so they can actually see 270 degrees. They've got 3 fovea as well. And this is an example of seeing into the UV. This is what we see. This flower looks yellow to us, but this is actually what this flower looks like to a hummingbird. So this is what, if you took a UV light and shined it on this flower, this is what it looks like. So this is what the birds see. This is what we see. So this is referred to as a flower target. That the flowers actually are much more obvious to the birds than they are to us. So here's an example of a bird that is quite interesting. This is the Clark's nutcracker. This is a bird that's found in the Rocky Mountains in the United States and Canada. And it's estimated that they cache about 30,000 pine seeds each year, and they cache them in about 5,000 different caches. And so what they've done is they've taken these birds and they've put them into these experimental designs. So this is a little cup that's full of sand here. And what you do is you let the corvid go in here and store seeds, and then you take the corvid away and you bring it back 5 days later, 10 days later, 15 days later, 30 days later, 2 months later, and let it go and see if it can still find seeds. And it turns out that these birds are really good at remembering where they put the seeds up to several months. Yes? Well, that's a good question. Okay, why do Clark's nutcrackers store their seeds? Clark's nutcrackers live on ridges in the mountains, and they store the seeds in the fall, and then they start breeding in February and March, when they then go and find the seeds to feed their young. And so that's how they get through the winters. They store these seeds on windswept places so that the snow doesn't accumulate them on there, and then in February and March they can go back and find the seeds and feed themselves and feed their young. It's a good question. So they've done these memory experiments, and one of the really neat experiments that was done was they let these Clark's nutcrackers go in and store their seeds, and they had rocks and they had tree trunks and things like that in the area, and then they took the Clark's nutcrackers out and they moved everything 6 inches to the right. They moved all the rocks to the 6 inches to the right, and they moved all the tree stumps, tree logs 6 inches to the right. And then they let the Clark's nutcrackers go back, and the Clark's nutcrackers look for their seeds 6 inches to the right. So they had memorized the surroundings, and they had put their seeds in, and they had memorized what the surroundings look like. And so, pretty neat experiment. Some of you may have seen this. This is getting a lot of publicity. It turns out that these crows on the island of New Caledonia make these tools out of twigs for extracting food out of these various structures. And it turns out that they make the tool exactly the right size for what they want to extract. So it's not like they're just making one size. They actually make different size tools for extracting different size insects. So, pretty amazing. Yeah. They actually make them. They actually take the twigs and they break them down to the size they want to, and then try and extract the. It's not like they're just picking up a twig. No, they actually manipulate the twig, break it down to the size they want it to be, and then they use a specific size twig to extract a specific size insect from the crevice. And then this is a famous pair. This is Irene Peppenberg, who was the woman who did these experiments with this bird, which she called Alex, the avian learning experiment. And she trained Alex, and Alex actually had a 150-word vocabulary and could identify 50 shapes and objects. So, quite amazing. So birds produce a wide variety of vocalizations. These vocalizations are used for a variety of things. Communicating with their flock members, communicating with their mate or maybe a potential mate, communicating with their neighbors. It's becoming clear now that male birds typically recognize their neighbors by their song, which is thought to decrease the amount of aggression that's needed to defend their territory, and vocalizations to identify family members. These non-passerines, these sub-off-scenes make a lot of different sounds, but it's not thought to be true songs. And then birds make a lot of notes and calls. Some birds actually make sounds with their feathers and their wings. So there are birds that are making these sounds that are not vocalizations at all. So in order to produce sound, a bird has to have a syrinx. And so this is the syrinx. This is the main structure. of the syrinx. There's this tympanic membrane that's important here. And so the only thing to show you here is that there are some syrinxes that are quite simple, and then there are some syrinxes that are quite complex. And so this is a crow syrinx here. And so the amount of sound, obviously, that a bird can make is going to be dependent on how complex their syrinx is. And it's controlling the amount of air that goes through this structure based on the musculature and the ligaments that are associated with the syrinx. So the syrinx is the structure that's responsible for making these complex sounds. Singing in males is typically controlled by testosterone. So here is the concentration, the blood concentration of testosterone. And here's this is for a song sparrow, a bird that's found in North America. And this is the amount of testosterone the male has during early spring. This is the amount of testosterone the male has during late spring. And then we see here the early fall, late fall, the testosterone drops off. The gonadal development is also dependent on testosterone. So the gonadal development is going to be great here for the males, but then as soon as the breeding season is over, the testosterone level drops off and the gonads degenerate, as we talked about before. In some species, the female sings. Female singing is possibly a territorial defense, trying to keep other females out of the territory, either trying to keep the females out so they won't mate with the particular female's male, or that they won't drop their eggs into another nest, which we'll talk about in a minute. A lot of birds duet, where the male and female actually sing together, and they take turns singing. The singing also might be mate guarding, where the female is trying to tell her mate where she is so that the male can guard her against another male sneaking in to copulate with her. And then in some species, the singing synchronizes the reproduction of the females and males. You can make females sing by injecting them with testosterone. So those are some early experiments that were done to see, you know, what happens if you inject a female with testosterone. Well, if you inject a female with testosterone in the spring, she starts singing just like a male. So another category are calls, and the coordination of behavior for calls. Certain activities are important for calling, and then the response to threats of predators is one of the main functions of calling. These calls are usually acoustically simple. They could serve a call could serve multiple functions. The reason that the calls are typically acoustically simple is it's hard for a predator to find an acoustically simple call. And that's been found in a series of birds. This is looking at chickens, and this is the call that they have if it's an aerial predator. So if they see an aerial predator like a raptor or a hawk, they use this signal to alert the other members of the flock that it's an aerial predator that's coming in. And this is the call that they give if it's a ground predator. So they actually have different calls for perceiving different kind of predators. And that warns the flock mates whether it's a bird coming in, an aerial predator, or whether it's a mammal or a snake, a ground predator. Okay, so if we look at the mating system, it turns out that most birds are monogamous, or at least socially monogamous, which we'll talk about in a minute. It's estimated that 92% of the birds are monogamous. There is polygyny, where males mate with several females. This is typical of species that are lekking species. We'll talk about what a lek is in a minute. And then in polygyny, typically the male does not participate in any of the carrying of the young. Polyandry is relatively rare. This is where females attract several males to mate with. And the parental care typically in polygyny is done by males. And then promiscuity occurs in about 6% of the birds. And so monogamy is where there is a pair bond. There is a bond that occurs between the male and the female. And when I said monogamy, this means that it could be for a single breeding attempt, it could be for the breeding season, or it could be for many breeding seasons. So those are various levels of monogamy. Typically, monogamy occurs where the male participation is essential for successfully rearing the young. So the idea here is that the female couldn't raise the young alone, and so having the male participate is essential. And so the other thing is that it's situations where the male cannot monopolize more resources so that he could have extra mates. So here's some examples here. The green bee-eater, a bird found here in Saudi Arabia that appears to be socially monogamous. And then the great extreme here, of course, is the hornbill. And so the African gray hornbill mates with the female, and then the female goes into a cavity, and the male seals her into the cavity with mud. And there's this little opening here, and the male then feeds her while she's incubating the egg. So every day the male comes and he shoves food through this little hole here and feeds the female. And when the eggs hatch and the young are ready to fledge, then the male and the female destroy this mud entrance, and the birds are able to hatch. But that's sort of the extreme. All hornbills do this, by the way. And typically these monogamous species have some elaborate courtship rituals or dances. And this is the courtship of the great crested grebe. And we don't have time to see the whole thing, but I encourage you to go Google great crested grebe, or go to YouTube and type in great crested grebe. This mating dance takes somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes. And it starts out with the male with his great display here, and the female who is interested in what's going on here. And then they start dancing together in this very stylized manner. And then they start exchanging vegetation. And it gets pretty interesting. They start entwining their necks, and eventually it ends up with a copulation taking place at the end of the dance. But it's pretty spectacular. I encourage you to go look at it. So polygyny is where males can attract more than one female, and typically the male quality, the territory quality varies among males. So some males have really good territories, and some males have really bad territories, or mediocre territories. And the females can assess this, and typically based on food availability. And so the females choose on the basis of this variation. This occurs often in grassland and marsh situations. And here's the great reed warbler, which is a Saudi example. This is the nest of the great reed warbler, and the great reed warbler males are able to attract multiple females to mate with. So lekking is a situation that occurs in birds and in some mammals where males get together, all the males in a population get together, and they display, and the females pick out the males that they want to mate with based on the displays. And so the males aggregate once a year, and this is referred to as the hot spots. And then there's variation in the males, and these are the hot shots. And it turns out that only a few males get to mate. Only a few males get to mate. All the females typically pick the same male, or one or two males out of the group. And so here's a male strutting his stuff and trying to attract a female to mate with him. So it's all based on female choice of some variation in the males, and the males do not participate in parental care at all. And in the other part of the year, these birds are widely dispersed. So only once a year do they come together to aggregate for this breeding purpose. So polyandry is when females are able to attract multiple males. This occurs when you have reverse sexual dimorphism. The females are actually bigger and more brightly colored. And here's an example here of the pheasant-tailed jacana. Jacanas are these birds that are associated typically with marshes that have lily pads. They have really long toes so they can walk on the lily pads. And the female jacana typically is able to attract 2 or 3, maybe 4 males, and she lays a clutch for each of the males, and then she abandons them, and the males incubate the eggs, and the males raise the young. So here's one of my favorites. This is Timix stint. This is a shorebird that actually migrates through here in spring and fall. The male attracts a female, and the female lays a clutch for him. And then she attracts another male and lays a clutch for herself. The first male then may attract a second female, and she lays her clutch in his territory. So, quite a system. But people think that maybe this is the evolutionary pathway to polyandry. Maybe this is how polyandry evolved, that you had a situation where the female's laying a clutch for the male, she's laying a clutch for herself, and eventually she just stops laying a clutch for herself. Just lays a clutch for the male. So maybe that's a possibility. One of the surprising things is that with molecular techniques, it's now been revealed that monogamy is not what we thought it was. That in many passerine populations, there is as much as 10 to 25% extra pair paternity. And when you get to fairy wrens in Australia, it's about 50%. 50% of the young are fathered or by somebody else other than the father. And it turns out that you also have multiple maternities. Okay? We've discovered that there are females that are dumping their eggs in other female nests rather than raising them themselves. And so this was sort of a great revelation that occurred within the last 30 years, that there is a lot more going on than we thought in terms of monogamy. Which leads to nest parasitism. And nest parasitism refers to the fact that birds will lay their eggs in other birds' nests. What we have here in ducks is you get intraspecific nest parasitism, which means that multiple females are laying their eggs in the same nest. And so here we have a female goldeneye who obviously has too many young. I mean, she didn't lay all those eggs. And so what happens here is that some other female goldeneyes laid eggs in her nest. And so she actually has this huge amount of young. That's called egg dumping. More commonly, we have obligate brood parasites, and this is the classic example. This is a cuckoo, the common cuckoo, nestling in a reed warbler nest. So what's happened here is that the cuckoo laid its egg in this nest, and when the cuckoo chick hatched, the cuckoo chick grew faster than the reed warbler chicks, and it actually got so big that it could go like this and knock all the other nestlings out. So it's the only thing left. And the adult is probably 3 or 4 times bigger than a reed warbler. So this is the reed warbler feeding the cuckoo chick, which obviously is much bigger than the reed warbler. Well, birds are called rejectors or acceptors. And some birds recognize that the egg in their nest is not theirs, and they knock the egg out, whereas other species don't recognize that the egg in the nest is another species, and they're called acceptors. It's hard when birds start feeding their young, it's hardwired. So it doesn't matter. You know, there's been a lot of things. There've been a lot of studies that have been done where a parent bird loses its nest and it starts feeding somebody else's nest. You know, once they start feeding their young, as long as they can hear begging, they're going to feed it. All right. So, yeah, good question. I mean, it looks really stupid, doesn't it? I mean, how big that bird is. All right. So the last thing about breeding we're talking about is cooperative breeding. And here's another example from here, the white-throated bee-eaters. This is a family group here. The adults lay the female lays the eggs, and then there are these helpers that hang around to help. And this has been documented in over 220 species of birds. And these are some of the characteristics: the low breeding rate, high adult survival, limited dispersal, deferred maturity, and this idea about inclusive fitness. You know, if you stay and help your parents raise more young, those young share a lot of genes with you. And so this is typical where birds typically delay 1 or 2 years where they stay with their parents, help them raise more young, and then become breeders themselves. So birds lay eggs. This is the classic amniotic egg. The amniotic egg was responsible for allowing reptiles and birds to be free from going back to water. So we talk about amphibians. Amphibians always have to go back to some source of water to breed. With the amniotic egg, then the birds were freed from water, breeding in water. And so here's some typical kinds of variation you see. There's great variation in size and color of eggs. Here we are again with our example. This is a hummingbird egg. This is an ostrich egg. And this is a moa egg. So you can see the size of the variation here. If you look at the egg mass on this axis versus the female body mass on this axis, you see that for all birds, it's a really tight line here, except for these 3 kiwis. And this is what a female kiwi looks like. This is an X-ray of a female kiwi before she's going to lay an egg. You can see how big the egg is. The egg is 20% of her body weight. And so the kiwis are off the scale. So the female produces this egg. It's 20% of her body weight, and she leaves. Okay, the male incubates. It takes like 75 days to incubate this egg. But the female doesn't participate in that at all. She leaves to try and recover. And these are the different kinds of nests. Some birds just lay their eggs on the ground. Other birds build a cup nest. The grebes that we talked about actually build a platform nest out in the water. Some birds, like kingfishers, burrow into the sides. Some birds build what's called a pendulous nest or a pencil nest. Some birds actually, like swallows, actually build their nest on the side of structures. And then birds like woodpeckers build their own cavity. They're called primary cavity. And then there's a whole group of birds that use old woodpecker holes, which are called secondary cavity nesters. Clutch size. seems to be, there's a trade-off between annual survivor and fecundity. This is a negative relationship. And the range is, some birds lay a single egg, whereas the most is the gray partridge, which typically lays 18 eggs or more. And that's what a gray partridge nest looks like. But you can see most birds lay 2 to 3 eggs. And there's variation between the tropics and the Arctic. Most all birds in the tropics lay 1 or 2 eggs. And then as you go further north to the temperate, the clutch sizes get bigger. And then when you get into the Arctic region, the clutch sizes are even bigger. And so there's been a lot of speculation about why do you have this variation, latitudinal variation. One suggestion is that it's because the temperate, it has more food in the summer than it does in the winter, and that the days are longer as you go further north in the poles, so that birds have more time to forage. And so that might be another suggestion put forward, was that there are more predators in the tropics, and so having a small clutch size is advantageous in terms of attracting predators to the nest. If you have smaller clutches, you don't make as many trips to the nest. So there's been quite a bit of speculation on that. So in terms of incubation, typically it's the females, but some males do incubate. The females lose all their feathers on their breast and on their belly during the breeding season, and this is called a brood patch. And so this is really highly vascularized, and the female can then put the skin directly on the surface of the eggs to incubate and warm the eggs. Most birds sit on the eggs. The small passerines, the amount of time that they incubate is 10 days, and like I said, the kiwi is nearly 80 days. There are some exceptions. Penguins, the female lays the eggs, and the males then incubate it, and they have the egg on their feet, and they cover it up with their feathers. And then these are the megapodes that are found in Southeast Asia. These birds actually build this mound, this dirt mound, and the female lays her eggs in the mound, and then the fermentation of the vegetation warms the eggs, and the male comes back periodically to check the eggs, and if they're too hot, he opens up the top, and if they're too cold, he puts some more on top, and so there's no incubation by the bird at all. So when birds hatch, some birds they hatch synchronously, and the eggs actually communicate with each other. I mean, they were laid at different times, but the eggs actually, the chicks make peeping noises, and the peeping noises cause the chicks that were younger to speed up their development, and they all hatch at the same time. This typically happens in ducks, and these are called precocial. There also is asynchronous hatching, that the eggs actually hatch in the order they were laid. These birds are typically altricial. They're not capable of taking care of themselves, typical of passerines. And then the super precocial are these birds, these megapodes that are in the ground in those mounds. And when they hatch, they just walk out and walk away. So they're perfectly capable of taking care of themselves right from the start. And then here are some others: the subprecocial, rails, grebes, and loons. Semi-precocial, the young are somewhat mobile. These are like gulls and terns. Semi-altricial, the young are not mobile, but their eyes are open. And then atricial are birds that are helpless. When they're born, they're absolutely helpless. They're naked. They're blind. And this is true of woodpeckers, hummingbirds, pigeons, and passerines. When we have parental care, feeding and brooding, altricial young are unable to regulate their body temperatures. They still have to be brooded at night. Biparental care is common. Males and females are both feeding the nest. In about 85 species, only the female takes care of the young, and in about 30 species, male. But these two, this is a rarer situation. So here is a study that was done on shorebirds. Oops. Shorebirds, and here's the biparental care where both parents are involved in raising the young. And then in this way, we go to female only. In this way, we go to male only. So you can see that by far the bipedal is the biparental is the one that's most common. And then the female only would be associated with this would be polyandry here, the male only, and this would be polygynous here with the female only. It turns out that most passerine birds, the young birds actually produce this sac that has all the fecal material in it, and the parent birds pick these up and fly away so that the waste doesn't accumulate at the nest and attract predators. And then most birds, young birds, when they open their mouth, the inside of their mouth is really brightly colored, and these are called mouth targets. And so it's easy for the parents to find where to put the food. And when birds fledge, you have a situation where this is the end of parental care. The parents abandon the birds. Parental care for some species goes on for months, but typically the most mortality in birds occurs in the first 3 months of fledging. So once you get past this first 3 months, the idea is that the mortality rate for birds is relatively constant. Some of you may remember this from general ecology, but you have a type 1 survivorship curve here where individuals live late in life. You've got the type 3 survivorship curve here where most individuals die before they reproduce. But then you've got this type 2 survivorship curve where the mortality is relatively constant over life, and that's typically for birds. So the last thing I want to talk about is migration. Dispersal is the movement away from and not coming back. The immigration is movement. Immigration is movement into a population, but migration is the movement away and return. And a lot of birds are migratory. They move away for the non-breeding season. They come back for the breeding season. Like I said, many theories have been proposed why birds actually migrate. And so back when we had bird banding data, the Arctic tern was thought to have the longest migration route in the world. And so here's the Arctic tern here. The Arctic tern breeds in the Arctic, as the name suggests. And then in the fall, it goes down the west coast of Africa, and some birds go down this way, some birds go down this way. They spend the winter down here in Antarctica, Terra del Fuego. In the spring, they go up this way, and then cross across and go this way. And of course, they're following the favorable winds when they do all this. And so it was supposed to be the largest. But then they started putting geolocators on birds, and geolocators are these devices you can put on the leg of a bird, and the geolocator keeps track of how much daylight and how much nighttime every day. And so it turns out that if you know which hemisphere the bird is in, north hemisphere or south hemisphere, and you know the daylight to sunlight ratio, you can tell exactly where the bird was. So that's what they do for geolocators. But you have to catch the bird again. So you put the geolocator on, you let it go, and you catch it again. And so then they started doing sooty shearwaters in the Pacific Ocean, and they found out that the Pacific Ocean, the sooty shearwaters go about 65,000 kilometers on average. So they're flying all the way around the Pacific Ocean. It's based on just the daylight ratios. And no, it's just based on the daylight and sunlight. Apparently, if you know the date, and you know the dark light ratio, you can tell where it was. You do know the date. Yeah. And okay, so now the sooty shade water is the new winner. But wait, there's more. Then they put geolocators on the Arctic terns. And it turns out the Arctic terns are going 71,000 kilometers. So Arctic tern's the winner still. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is what happens in the Middle East. We have this migration through the Middle East. It's estimated that 500 million birds pass through the Middle East twice a year in fall and spring migration. Here are our zoological realms, and here are the migratory pathways in the Old World. And we see here that we have the Western Asian, Eastern Asian flyway that comes through here. The Central Asian flyway comes through here. And the Black Sea Mediterranean flyway, they all come through this region here. Okay, with that, I'm going to stop and be happy to answer any questions you might have.